It's the most mysterious age, but it's also one of my favourites. What am I saying? They're all my favourites. Maya, Govan and Melyn, and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled Top 10 list. Today I'll be talking about 10 of my favourite characters to feature in Middle-earth's Second Age, the Age of the Alliance, the age that bridges the Silmarillion to the Lord of the Rings. Number 10. King Orophair, the grandfather of Legolas. So, Orophair is one of those elven characters who comes into the story right at the beginning of the Second Age and goes out right at the end of it. Orophair's life basically is the Second Age. And at the beginning of that age, he was among the Sindar refugees who had escaped Doriath and then all of Beleriand after the cataclysm of the War of Wrath, which ended the First Age, and when we meet him in the Second Age, it is in Lindon, the vast kingdom of the Noldor's new High King, Gil-galad. But Noldorine exiles from Valinor and Dark Elven Sindar of Doriath are very much not the same. And within the relatively early years of the Second Age, there are two Sindar princes specifically who gathered their Sindar people and journeyed east, away from Lindon and over the Misty Mountains to find new lands where they could build new homes. One of these princes was a guy called Amdir, and the other was Prince Orophair. Amdir led his people a little further south than Orophair did, and they came to dwell in a golden wood that the Sindar called Lothlorien. And there Amdir ruled as a Sindar king presiding over a predominantly Sylvan population. And just to the north, Orophair does a very similar thing. Except instead of settling in the secretive Golden Wood, Orophair takes up rulership of the vast realm known back then as the Greenwood. But just like Amdir in Lothlorien, Orophair and his relatively small number of Sindar followers lived among and ruled over a much larger population of Sylvan elves, wood elves. And this is important because Tolkien tells us that in time, Orophair totally went native. His people merged with the indigenous Sylvan, and they began to adopt their customs and their traditions and even their language. It seems that Orophair wanted his people to return to the simpler and more natural existence that they would have known before the coming of Morgoth and the return of the Noldor in the First Age. In fact, Orophair even wanted to return his people's way of life to the elven primeval days by the waters of their awakening, before even the Valar learned of their existence. And Orophair's disdain for the Noldor is a very important part of the Greenwood's history throughout all of the Second Age, and it's a very important part of his character. Because, perhaps unfairly, perhaps fairly, Orophair blames the Noldor for all the hardships that his Sindar people suffered during the First Age, and so he wants nothing to do with them. Back in the early Second Age, this wasn't really a problem, as all of Gil-galad's Noldor lived on the west side of the Misty Mountains, and in the east there were only Dark Elves. And Orophair's realm was vast, stretching all the way down to the very south of the Greenwood, where he even established his capital, here on the hill of Amon Lanc. But then all that ring-forging business began in Eregion, which I will talk about very soon, and, as is always the case, the Noldor's war with Sauron had massive ramifications for the elves in the east. After the fall of Eregion, Sauron was an open enemy to all of the elves of Middle-earth, and as he established his power in the south, his shadow crept closer and closer to the Greenwood. We are told that Orophair withdrew his people north 3 times during his reign, and towards the end of the Second Age, the woodland realm was but a fraction of the size that it once was. It seems that what Orophair truly wants is isolation. He moves his people north when Galadriel arrives for the first time in Lothlorien, and he moves his people again when the dwarves of Khazad-dûm begin to rise in might, which strikes me as a very un-Tolkienian theme. Generally, Tolkien's writings are all about different people coming together to do good that no one group could accomplish on their own. and yet Orather represents the complete opposite of that. However, because Tolkien is the one in control, Orather and his woodland realm cannot avoid the creeping shadow forever, and by the end of the Second Age, Orather and his son Thranduil are finally forced to unite with the Noldor and many other peoples of Middle-earth too in the War of the Last Alliance. And although the War of the Last Alliance does go the Alliance's way in the end, all 4 of the named kings who fight in it are killed. And in the case of Orather, his death comes as a direct consequence of his inability to play nice with others. So, due to his prejudice towards all Noldor, Orather refuses to put himself under the supreme command of High King Gil-galad, and this has dire results for his people. Both Orather and Armadir of Lothlorien order their Sylvan armies to charge before Gil-galad gives the command, and in the early battles of that war, both Armadir and Orather are slain, along with 2/3 of their Sylvan armies. They take such atrocious casualties, and to be honest, it is kind of Orather's fault. But I included him on this list nonetheless because I think the Sindar and Sylvan of the East are a really fascinating but frequently overlooked part of the Second Age. And of course, the story of Orather and his death in disastrous battle is directly tied to the story of his son, Thranduil, who seems to inherit his father's fear of the South, and yet is also forced to endure the consequences of Greenwood the Great becoming corrupted into Mirkwood, and Orather's former capital of Armon Lanc turning into Sauron's Tower of Dol Guldur. Orather's story is a massive part of Thranduil's backstory. But I already have a whole video about Thranduil and the post-traumatic stress that he seems to suffer after the War of the Last Alliance, so check this out after this video if you want to learn more. Number 9. Aldarion. So in many ways, Aldarion is the complete opposite of Orather, but he is still a king, the 6th king of Númenor in fact, although before he took the throne, he was known as the Great Mariner. And Aldarion had the good fortune of being born towards the beginning of Númenor's history, so in the days of his youth he was living what would by all accounts seem a pretty perfect life. But Aldarion is a very complex character. There's not a huge number of others like him in the Legendarium. You see, Aldarion is absolutely obsessed with the sea, and with voyaging, and with sailing the world in exploration. And one of the primary themes of his story is his struggle to balance that desire to go to sea with his responsibilities as a prince and a husband at home. During his lifetime, Aldarion goes on many long voyages, and he even establishes Númenorian havens on the coasts of Middle-earth. In fact, he also ventures upriver and even comes face to face with Galadriel herself at the waterlands known as Swanfleet. But it is at the much more familiar Grey Havens in Lindon that Aldarion meets the Noldor's High King Gil-galad. And this meeting is truly auspicious. Aldarion and Gil-galad develop a powerful friendship that effectively binds the Númenorians and the Noldor together, at least in the beginning. And I think the bond between Aldarion and Gil-galad is what sets the stage for the bond that will of course one day grow between Elendil and Gil-galad before blossoming into the Last Alliance. However, what makes Aldarion such an interesting character is that unlike many others, he is not an all-out good guy. But he's certainly not a bad guy either. He feels very human, and this conflict with his family seems a lot more grounded in reality than many of the other more mythical parts of the Legendarium. So, as I've already said, Aldarion's personality is guided to a massive extent by his obsessive love of sailing and being upon the sea. The mariner's life seems to call to him in a way that most members of his family simply cannot understand. Aldarion's father is a guy called Meneldur, the 5th king of Númenor, and Aldarion's wife is a lady of Númenor called Erendis. However, to be honest, Aldarion doesn't have the best relationship with either of them. As the king's heir, he is expected to remain in Numenor and to do his duties as the crowned prince. But much to Meneldur's irritation, Aldarion spends years and years at a time voyaging away from Numenor and seemingly shirking his responsibilities to his nation and his people. Similarly, Erendis and Aldarion have a somewhat fraught relationship, which seems to grow out of the fact that they are such different people when it comes to their priorities. As I've said, Aldarion was a man of the sea, and so when he looked at trees, what he saw was timber, the ships, and when he thought about Numenor's future, he imagined colonies in Middle-earth. However, Erendis was a lover of forests. She despised the felling of trees for the building of ships, and she seems to have a real resentment for sailors. Basically, Aldarion could not find fulfillment when he was ashore, and Erendis could not be content when he was away. Over the course of his life, Aldarion's father Meneldur forbids him from sailing to Middle-earth, and his relationship with Erendis deteriorates too. Like, massively. In the end, Meneldur becomes furious at Aldarion for disobeying his command, and Erendis eventually removes herself and their daughter all the way inland to be raised on a farm where she is taught to despise all men, which is a little bit extreme, but it's an illustration of the great rift that Aldarion's voyaging causes amongst his family. And so, the question is, who is in the right here? I guess on the one hand, it's easy to argue that Aldarion is being very selfish by prioritizing the sea over his family and his nation, but I also think the opposite argument holds water too. Are Erendis and Meneldur the ones who are being selfish by demanding that Aldarion gives up his greatest desire for their sake? I mean, it's definitely true to say that Aldarion isn't a very good husband, or a particularly good father, or a good son, or a good prince, but the way his story ends makes him an incredibly compelling character. You see, in the year 882 of the Second Age, the now elderly king Meneldur receives a letter all the way from Middle-earth. And this letter was written by High King Gil-galad himself. And what Gil-galad wrote to Meneldur is a fascinating fresh perspective on Aldarion's actions. The first thing Gil-galad writes to Meneldur is thank you. He says, "Long have I owed you thanks, for you have so many times sent to me your son, the greatest elf friend that now is among men." Gil-galad goes on to beg Meneldur's pardon for keeping Aldarion away from home for so long, and he takes full responsibility for the delays in Aldarion's returns. But Gil-galad explains that it was all worth it, for Aldarion brought great knowledge and counsel to Middle-earth, and this is made all the more necessary by the fact that a secret shadow has been growing in the east. And Gil-galad perceives that this enemy is a servant of Morgoth's. He goes on to write that if a new Dark Lord does rise, the elves alone will not be powerful enough to resist him. An alliance must be built between the Eldar and the Númenóreans, and thanks to the voyages of Aldarion, that alliance is beginning to come into existence. And so, although Aldarion's actions caused anger and resentment for his father and his wife, from a big picture perspective, Aldarion was right. He has this obsession that his family do not understand, and he spends most of his life being told that what he's doing is wrong, and that his true priority should be staying home in Númenor. And yet, in the end, Aldarion's obsession is what sets in motion one of the most significant events of the Second Age. Yes, it's true, he could have been a much better husband, and he could have been a much more dutiful son, but if he had, would there even have been a last alliance? I don't know. Number 8. Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor is one of the most important characters in the entire history of the Second Age, But the truth is, he doesn't live to see the second half of it. Celebrimbor's great claim to fame is that he is the Lord of Eregion, and he is one of the greatest craftsmen of that age. In fact, he is the grandson of Feanor, who was the greatest craftsman of the First Age. And the main thing that Celebrimbor is known for crafting are the Rings of Power. So, in the year 1200 of the Second Age, the Noldor of the North are visited by a fair and angelic being who calls himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And although Gil-galad and Galadriel are both pretty suspicious of this fair stranger, Celebrimbor welcomes him into Eregion and learns much under Anatar's tutelage. Celebrimbor's guild of jewelsmiths are known as the Gwaithir Myrdain, and under Celebrimbor and Anatar's guidance, these elves of Eregion forge all the lesser rings of power. But Celebrimbor also forges 3 rings in secret, totally absent the influence of Anatar, although still using his knowledge and lore. These 3 rings of Celebrimbor are of course the 3 elven rings, Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, which will go on to be borne by Elrond, Gandalf, and Galadriel in the Third Age. And the reason this is all so significant is because Anatar is of course not what he claims to be. The Lord of Gifts is merely a deception. Anatar is Sauron. Sauron is the one who instructs Celebrimbor's craft of the rings, and it's Sauron's knowledge that goes into the forging of even the 3 elven rings. Now, Sauron's deception is finally revealed to Celebrimbor in the year 1600 of the Second Age, when Sauron also forged a ring in secret, the One Ring, to bind all others. As soon as Sauron places the ring on his finger, Celebrimbor feels his evil, and he perceives that he's been betrayed. He sends the 3 rings away to Galadriel and Gil-galad, and he keeps the other 16 rings of power in Eregion, where he refuses to allow Sauron to reclaim them. And this is what begins the War of the Elves and Sauron, the first war of the Second Age. In this war, Eregion is conquered, and the 16 rings are taken by Sauron to later be distributed as the 7 and the 9. And I'll talk more about this war a little later down the list, but during the sack of Eregion, Celebrimbor meets a truly gruesome end. He was captured by Sauron and tortured for the location of the 16 rings and for the 3 that he made in secret. But although we know that Sauron did later reclaim the 7 and the 9, even after 2 years of torture, Celebrimbor never revealed where he'd hidden the Elven 3. But after Celebrimbor's brutal torture, his story gets even darker. Because when Celebrimbor did eventually die of his torment, his body was shot with arrows and hung upon a pole to be carried by Sauron's orc armies as a war banner. Throughout the rest of the conflict, Sauron's armies go into battle bearing the desecrated body of Celebrimbor. Number 7. The Blue Wizards. So, in the unfinished tales, we are told that the Blue Wizards are called Alatar and Palando, and they did not come to Middle-earth until 1,000 years into the Third Age, along with Gandalf and Radagast and Saruman. According to those writings, there were no wizards in the Second Age. However, in Tolkien's later writings, we are given a different story. In a chapter of the Peoples of Middle-earth, which is simply called Last Writings, we are told that the 2 blue wizards came to Middle-earth much, much earlier than Gandalf or Radagast or Saruman, and they arrived at the Grey Havens in the same year that Sauron forged the One Ring. But the Blue Wizards did not arrive in Middle-earth on their own. They came at around the same time that Glorfindel returned to Middle-earth to aid Gil-galad and his elves in the coming war against Sauron. However, the blue wizards did not stay in the west with the elves. Instead, they journeyed off into the east. And that is the very last thing that can be said about them with absolute certainty. Nevertheless, the blue wizards are one of the most fertile grounds for speculation in the entire legendarium. In his last writings, Tolkien gave the blue wizards new names: Morinatar, which means Darkness Slayer, and Romestamo, which means Helper of the East. And unlike in his earlier accounts, where it's implied that these blue wizards eventually turned to the dark side and founded secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron, in the later writings, Morinatar and Romestamo stay true to their task, and they stir up rebellion in the East and give aid to the clans of men who reject the worship of Melkor and ally themselves against Sauron. Tolkien states that the blue wizards must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would, both in the Second Age and Third Age, otherwise have outnumbered the West. And I find this fascinating. The blue wizards are so mysterious, but there is a massively prominent theme in all of Tolkien's writings that whilst the famous heroes are off doing their thing to bring down whatever Dark Lord they happen to be facing, there are other lesser-known heroes working in the background and doing their part to ensure that evil cannot triumph in the end. If not for the blue wizards in the East, perhaps the armies of the Last Alliance would have failed to defeat Sauron at the end of the age. If not for lesser-known characters like Morinatar and Romestamo, the much more famous characters like Elrond and Isildur may not have been enough to vanquish the Dark Lord. Number 6. Celeborn. So, I feel like a lot of the time, Celeborn gets a little bit neglected in favour of his much more famous wife, Galadriel. And it's an undeniable fact that Galadriel is an absolutely awesome character who deserves every inch of spotlight she gets, but so too is Celeborn. And during the Second Age, Celeborn is actually a more significant player than Galadriel. At the beginning of the Second Age, Celeborn rules a southern fiefdom of Gil-galad's kingdom called Harlindon. But relatively early on, Celeborn and Galadriel go off on a bit of a road trip around Middle-earth, with a bunch of followers from among the Sindar and the woodland Nandor, the Sylvan elves. And they go off to explore loads of really cool places. First up, they journey to the lake, where Elendil will one day build the capital city of Arinor, but then they journey to Eregion, where they live with Celebrimbor for a while. And, at some point in the very early Second Age, Celeborn and Galadriel have their only child, Celebrian, who will one day go on to marry Elrond and thus be the mother of Arwen and her twin brothers. And after a few hundred years in Eregion, Galadriel sets off with Celebrian into Khazad-dûm, where they pass through the Misty Mountains and come out on the other side, near the Golden Wood of Lothlorien. And this is the first time that Galadriel becomes known to the elves of that wood. However, what I find very interesting is that Celeborn does not go east with his wife and his daughter. Instead, he stays in Eregion. And this means that Celeborn was hanging around in that part of the world when Sauron declared war on the elves and brought ruin to the realm of Celebrimbor. We are told that Celeborn fought in the battle in which Celebrimbor was captured, and after their defeat, Celeborn led the survivors out of Eregion and brought them back towards Gil-galad's kingdom of Lindon. And there they encountered the host of Elrond. The two elven groups united, but Sauron's forces overwhelmed them anyway, and the only reason that Celeborn and Elrond survived this battle is because they discovered the hidden valley where Elrond would go on to found the stronghold of Rivendell. So, it's definitely worth noting that although Elrond is the guy who founded Rivendell and watched over it, in the very earliest days of that secret refuge, Elrond's future father-in-law, Celeborn, was also present, and he was part of the group that established it. After the end of the war, Galadriel and Celebrian passed through Khazad-dûm again, and they returned to Celeborn in Rivendell. And then Galadriel and Celeborn ventured off again, this time into the lands that will one day be known as Gondor. We're not told anything specifically about it, but we can certainly speculate that this would mean Celeborn and Galadriel would have had a very close relationship with Isildur and his brother right at the end of the Second Age after the downfall of Númenor. Which leaves us with the question, did Celeborn fight in the War of the Last Alliance? The short answer is we don't know. Tolkien never specifies, but I would confidently speculate that yes, he did. We know that Celeborn was a great warrior in the Second Age, we know he fought Sauron in the First War of that age, and we know he would continue to fight Sauron even up to the end of the Third Age, and so I certainly consider it likely that he would have joined the alliance between his mannish neighbours in Gondor and his former neighbours up in Lindon. Number 5. Gil-galad. So this is a character that I've already mentioned quite a few times on this list, but he definitely deserves his own entry because throughout the entire Second Age, there really are only two constants, Gil-galad and Sauron. Right at the beginning of the Second Age, Gil-galad establishes his kingdom of Lindon, and he rules over pretty much all of the northwest of Middle-earth. And Gil-galad is one of those characters who is just astoundingly great at so many things. We know he's an incredible warrior, but he's also incredibly wise and far-sighted, and he's noble and powerful and kind. When Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, first appeared in the north, Gil-galad was among the small number of elves who instantly mistrusted him. And when Anatar's treachery was revealed, it was to Gil-galad that Celebrimbor sent the mightiest of the elven rings, Vilya, the Ring of Air. When Eregion was sacked, Gil-galad led the elven armies in their first war against Sauron, and it was Gil-galad who sent Elrond with reinforcements to aid the vanquished peoples of Eregion. If not for this decision, Celeborn may very well have been killed, and Elrond would never have founded Rivendell. Anyway, the War of the Elves and Sauron was eventually won by the Elves, due in part to the friendship that Gil-galad once formed with Aldarion. The friendship that set the foundations for the alliance of the Noldor and the Númenóreans. 900 years after meeting Aldarion, Aldarion's great-great-great-grandson Tar-Minas-Tir sent a great fleet of Númenórean warriors to aid Gil-galad in this war, and together they utterly expelled Sauron and all of his armies from the north. Throughout much of the rest of the Second Age, Gil-galad continued to rule as the High King in the north and to resist the growing shadow of Sauron. But everything came to a head in the year 3319 of the Second Age. Thanks to Sauron, the island nation of Númenor was completely wiped off the map, and when Sauron returned to Mordor, Gil-galad was once again forced to make war upon him. Except this time, he had the support of the Númenóreans from the beginning. So after Númenor was destroyed, the faithful Númenóreans that survived were washed up on the coasts of Middle-earth. 4 of their ships landed in the south, where Isildur and his brother went on to found Gondor, but in the north their father Elendil landed on the shores of Gil-galad's realm. And just as he had done with Aldarion and Minas Tirith over 1,000 years before, Gil-galad developed a powerful friendship with Elendil and his now exiled Númenóreans. In fact, Gil-galad and his elves helped Elendil and his men build their new kingdom of Arnor. But then came the War of the Last Alliance. Down in Gondor, Isildur's city of Minas Ithil was attacked, and for the last time in Middle-earth's history, an alliance of Noldor, Sindar, Dunedain, and dwarves all united to do battle with the Dark Lord. And in this war, Gil-galad was the supreme commander. His armies joined Elendil's at the hill now known as Weathertop, and together they marched to Rivendell, where they spent 3 years building their strength. When all was finally ready, Gil-galad marched his army over the Misty Mountains and down towards the Black Gate. At the Battle of Dagorlad, Orophair got himself killed pretty quickly, but eventually Gil-galad and his army overpowered Sauron's forces and broke through the Black Gate. And then began the 7-year-long siege of Barad-dûr. Sauron's army had been beaten on the battlefield, but inside his dark tower they could not be vanquished by the last alliance. And Sauron had seemingly unlimited ammunition with which to defend Barad-dûr. So for 7 years, Gil-galad and the last alliance set up camp on the plains of Gorgoroth, and it wasn't until the year 3441 that Sauron was finally forced to leave his tower. He broke through his enemy's defences and made for Mount Doom. But there he was fought in one of the most epic 2-on-1 duels ever. Sauron versus Elendil and Gil-galad. In that battle, Sauron was greatly wounded and effectively vanquished by the combined kings of the Alliance, but both Elendil and Gil-galad gave their lives to bring him down. Tolkien tells us that the High Elven King was burned to death by the heat of Sauron's hand, possibly by the power of the One Ring itself. And thus passed Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor. Number 4. Sauron. Now, Sauron is a guy I've spent a lot of time talking about on this channel, and when it comes to the Second Age, there is an awful lot to say about him. So much so that if I were to go into full detail right now, this video would be like 4 or 5 hours long. However, I do already have a video about Sauron's life in the Second Age, and a few weeks back I released a video about Númenor, where I talked quite a lot about Sauron's role in the downfall of that kingdom. So right now I'll focus mainly on Sauron's actions in Middle-earth and his conflicts with the elves. But the first thing to say about this is that the Second Age really is Sauron's age. Obviously he was kicking about in the First Age, and we know that he endures right up until the end of the Third Age, but it is in the Second Age that we see Sauron at the absolute top of his game. The first time that we see Sauron in the Second Age is when he comes to the north in the guise of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and after the Rings of Power are forged with Celebrimbor, this begins the War of the Elves and Sauron, which after the War of the Last Alliance is the greatest war of the Second Age. Sauron sacks Eregion, he besieges Imladris, he reclaims the 16 Rings of Power, he divides them into the 7 and the 9, he overruns the entire north of Middle-earth, and then he is soundly defeated. The War of the Elves and Sauron ends in a major victory for the elves thanks to their newly arrived Númenorian allies. But what happens after the war is such a great illustration of what makes Sauron so dangerous and such a cool villain. Because Sauron is many, many things, but he's not really a warrior. Fighting is not what he's best at. Deception is the weapon Sauron wields like no other, and so, although in the year 1701 of the Second Age, Sauron loses his 8-year-long war and he flees back to Mordor with only a handful of bodyguards, for well over 1,000 years after that, he pretty objectively wins the peace. The victory of the North came at a severe cost, and after the War of the Elves and Sauron, Eregion was forever ruined. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm shut themselves off beneath their mountains, and the elven realms were pushed back further and further into the north. And so, in time, all of the south and all of the east fell under the dominion of Sauron. And this period in Middle-earth's history is known as the Dark Years, the millennia in which Sauron ruled pretty much all the men of Middle-earth. And as I say, these Dark Years were not a short thing. Even at the most conservative definition, Sauron ruled most of Middle-earth for 1,500 years. To put that in perspective, Morgoth's dominion over Beleriand in the First Age, that only lasted 135 years. For almost half of the entire Second Age, Sauron was the guy in charge, and Middle-earth went backward, and light and wisdom faded. Now, it's true, of course, that not everyone in Middle-earth fell under Sauron's dominion. Gil-galad's elves of the north resisted him throughout the entirety of the Dark Years, but they were few, and their power was limited to the north. There were also the dwarves of Khazad-dûm who remained untouched by Sauron in their mountain stronghold, but in other parts of Middle-earth, dwarves fared no better than men. During the Dark Years, the Grey Mountains were first overrun by orcs, and the holy dwarven mountain of Gundabad was conquered and occupied by Sauron's minions. It is during this period that the men of the White Mountains, the men who would go on to be the Oathbreakers or the Army of the Dead, first began worshipping Sauron, and he became a god-king to many of the Easterlings and Southrons who had the misfortune of living in Sauron's part of the world. Exactly 550 years after the War of the Elves and Sauron, the Nazgûl first appeared in Middle-earth, and Sauron became known as the King of Kings and the Lord of the Earth. However, in my mind, perhaps the most heinous thing that Sauron ever does, which only gets a brief mention by Tolkien, is his burning of the lands between southern Mirkwood and the Emyn Muil. So, by the time of The Lord of the Rings, this part of the world is known as the Brown Lands, and they are described as a withered desolation without trees or grass of any kind. It's basically a burned desert. But in the Second Age, these lands were the home of the Entwives. This is where they tended their gardens, and where they once taught local men the art of agriculture. It was a wonderful, beautiful, blossoming place. But towards the end of the Dark Years, Sauron burned those gardens, and he burned the Entwives with them. Well, technically, actually, we're never explicitly told what happens to the Entwives beyond that they were lost, and Treebeard actually speculates that maybe some still live somewhere. But honestly, I think that's kind of naive. In my mind, Sauron either burned the Entwives alive, or he burned most of them and took some others as slaves to tend to the agriculture of Mordor. Either way, it is horrendous. And maybe the worst part of this is that it was all for nothing. Sauron set fire to the Brown Lands as a way of slowing the advance of the Last Alliance, but they came for him anyway. And as everyone knows, after 12 years of fighting, Sauron was finally overthrown, and the Second Age ended. Number 3. Elrond Half-Elven. So, the story of Elrond's ancestry and his heritage is pretty much the entire story of the First Age. Elrond is basically a descendant of every single major hero in the Silmarillion, but he is only 58 years old when the First Age ends. And aside from witnessing a massacre and then being adopted by one of the perpetrators of said massacre, Elrond doesn't really do very much in the First Age. But the Second Age, this is the age where Elrond becomes the epic badass we all know and love. So the first thing to say about Elrond, which is often overlooked, is that he is only half-elven, and he has a twin brother who lives as a mortal man, Elros, the first king of Númenor. And just like Elros, Elrond is given the choice of whether he wants to live as a mortal man or as an immortal elf. Unlike his brother, Elrond obviously chooses immortality, and so he goes on to become one of the most important elves of not only the Second Age, but the Third Age too. At the beginning of the Second Age, Elrond dwells in Lindon under the kingship of his distant cousin, Gil-galad. And along with a small number of others, Elrond was one of the elves who distrusted Annatar when he came to Lindon bearing gifts. After the whole ring-forging business with Celebrimbor and the ruin of Eregion, Elrond was drawn into the War of the Elves and Sauron, and in that war he served as Gil-galad's herald. He led a force of elves to try and reinforce Eregion, but he was too late to save it. And in the end, he and his warriors were forced to flee north, where they eventually discovered the hidden valley, and Elrond founded Imladris, better known in later years as Rivendell. During the war, Imladris was besieged by Sauron's armies, but it held out. When Gil-galad and his Númenórean allies ended the War of the Elves and Sauron, Rivendell became a safe stronghold for many of Eregion's refugees, and many of the elves that had followed Celeborn. Gil-galad ordered Elrond to rule in Rivendell, and he bestowed upon Elrond the title Vice-Regent in the North, and he even gifted to Elrond the elven ring Vilya, mightiest of the three. And so, throughout most of the Second Age, Elrond remains in Imladris, where he builds it into the homely house for which it will one day become known. However, towards the end of the Second Age, during the War of the Last Alliance, Elrond goes to war once again, and once again he serves under the command of his beloved Gil-galad. He was present at all the major battles, and he was among those who witnessed the final duel of Sauron against the High Kings Gil-galad and Elendil. After Sauron was defeated, Elrond, along with Círdan, perceived the danger of the One Ring, and he urged Isildur to destroy it, but I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Anyway, the last thing to say about Elrond in the Second Age is that after the death of Gil-galad, there was no one in the world with a better claim to the High Kingship of the Noldor than Elrond. But he refuses to take up the crown. He declares that the line of Noldorine kings ended with Gil-galad, and so he never rules as anything more than the Lord of Imladris, even though he certainly could. Such is the humility and integrity of Elrond. Number 2. Círdan the Shipwright. So, I've said a number of times before on this channel that Círdan is my joint #1 favourite elf in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. I love him so much, and the only reason that I've not placed him at #1 on this list is simply that, although Círdan's life is thoroughly amazing, most of his greatest moments actually come in either the First Age or the Third Age. But nevertheless, Círdan the Shipwright is still an absolute legend of the Second Age. So, after the ruin of the First Age, Círdan established the coastal havens of Mithlond, much better known as the Grey Havens, and there Círdan built the ships that would send the elves west. But what you need to know about Círdan is that even in the Second Age, he is one of the oldest elves in all of Middle-earth. And towards the end of the First Age, Círdan was the one who raised Gil-galad, and who kept him safe during the wars with Morgoth. So when Gil-galad became king in the Second Age, Círdan already has a really close relationship with him. He's basically Gil-galad's mentor, his advisor, his guardian, and his second-in-command. When early Númenóreans first sailed to Middle-earth, it was Círdan who met them at the Grey Havens, and it was Círdan who taught Aldarion the elven method of building ships. When Annatar came, Círdan cautioned against trusting him, and he even cautioned Celebrimbor against the whole ring-forging idea in general. After Sauron's treachery was made known, Celebrimbor sent to Círdan Narya, the elven ring of fire, which Círdan bore for all of the rest of the Second Age, before he eventually gave it to Gandalf around the 1000th year of the Third Age. And this is what Círdan is all about. This is why I like him so much. Throughout every age of Middle-earth, Círdan is present, in the background, but doing unspeakably important work to resist the dominion of evil. Even when the north of Middle-earth fell to Sauron, the Grey Havens were never conquered. Just like Rivendell, they were a small elven stronghold where a ring of power resided in secret, and an awe-inspiringly wonderful elven lord kept it safe. Just like Elrond, Círdan followed Gil-galad into the War of the Last Alliance, where he served as the second-in-command of Gil-galad's armies. He fought alongside his foster son, and he watched him die in combat with Sauron. And after Sauron's defeat, Círdan, being the most foresighted of all elves, a gift that was given to him by the Valar, he urged Isildur to throw the captured ring into the fires of Mount Doom, the one place where he perceived maybe it could be unmade. And although this isn't obviously what ends up happening, with the benefit of hindsight, we can certainly say that Círdan was right. He figured out what had to be done 3,000 years before the ring was eventually destroyed. There is no character quite like Círdan. Number 1. Isildur. Now, unlike someone such as Eldarion or Orophaire, Isildur is a pretty household name. I'm sure everyone watching this will have already heard of him, but if you're mainly familiar with the Lord of the Rings movies, then you may very well have an incredibly skewed opinion of this character. In the movies, he is at best an anti-hero, and he's portrayed as being incredibly corrupted by the ring. But this is straight up slander. The Isildur that Tolkien wrote is such an awesome guy, and his character is done so dirty by Peter Jackson. If you take nothing else from this video, please let me defend one of the greatest men in the entire Second Age. Seriously, Isildur is a legend. So, in my top 10 facts about Númenor video, I talked about how in his relative youth, Isildur lived with his father and his brother in the Númenorian city of Rhomenna, where the faithful Númenorians dwelt in opposition to the Melkor-worshipping, Sauron-serving Kingsmen. And during Sauron's spiritual conquest of Númenor, one of the first things he did was order that the White Tree of Númenor be cut down and burned. But thanks to Isildur, a fruit from this white tree survived. Isildur was almost killed in the process of rescuing it, but from that fruit, Isildur was later able to plant the first white tree of Gondor. After the downfall of Númenor, Isildur and his brother Anarion became the joint kings of the southern Dúnedain kingdom, where Isildur ruled from the city of Minas Ithil. And Minas Ithil was the first place to come under attack in the opening gambit of what became the War of the Last Alliance. By far the most famous thing that Isildur does in the War of the Last Alliance is witness the death of his father at the hand of Sauron, and then finally cut the ring from Sauron's finger. But Elendil is not the only family member of Isildur's to die in this war. Isildur's brother and co-king Anarion was also slain in the siege of Barad-dûr, and so both Arinor and Gondor have now lost a king. Which brings us to Isildur's fateful decision to not destroy the ring. And this is where I feel like most of the anti-Isildur sentiment comes from. But let me take a moment to explain why it is so unfair to blame Isildur for this. Firstly, Isildur doesn't take the ring out of greed or wickedness or a lust for power. It doesn't corrupt him, he simply takes it as reparations for all the horrendous things that Sauron has done to his Númenorian people. The word Tolkien uses is weregild, which is an old Anglo-Saxon term meaning man price. And under ancient Germanic law, a weregild was simply financial compensation given to the family of a murdered person by the person or kin of that person who committed the murder. And if we take a look at all the things that Sauron has done to Isildur's family and to his people, I think we'll find that Isildur was more than within his rights to take the ring. Sauron brought ruin to Númenor. He ordered the human sacrifice of many faithful Númenorians. He conquered Minas Ithil, burned 2 white trees, killed Elendil, and also killed Anarion. By the customs of the free people, no one had a better claim to take the ring than Isildur. And he took it believing that it would bring peace and restitution to his decimated people. Secondly, it's very easy to say that Isildur should have just destroyed the ring with the benefit of hindsight, but we're passing that judgment with full knowledge of A, what the ring is, and B, what's going to happen over the next 3,000 years. But this information was not available to anyone at the end of the Second Age, let alone Isildur. No one knew that Sauron's essence survived inside the One Ring. No one really even knew what the One Ring was, and no one knew that as long as it survived, Sauron would survive too. From the perspective of the Last Alliance, Sauron is dead, and this golden ring is among the spoils of war. It's true that both Elrond and Círdan urged Isildur to destroy it instead of claiming it, but that's just because they were like super wise and gifted with foresight. But they didn't know Sauron would rise again unless it was thrown into the fire, and the true nature of the One Ring was known to no one save Sauron and his Nazgûl. Thirdly, not long after taking the One Ring, Isildur totally did wise up to the fact that this may not be a good thing to hold on to. 2 years after the ring came to him, Isildur journeyed north from Gondor to take up the kingship of Arnor, and tragically, on that journey northward, he was killed at the Gladden Fields. But just before he died, Isildur said this about the ring: "I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It should go to the keepers of the three." So there you go. Before the end of his life, Isildur totally did share the wisdom of Elrond and Círdan. He was not corrupt. And finally, even if this scene did happen in the books the way it happened in the movies, even if Isildur actually did stand at the cracks of doom and did refuse to cast the ring away, even if his heart was corrupted, which it wasn't, even then, it would still be an abject injustice to blame him for it. In Tolkien's exact words, "So great was the ring's power of lust that anyone who used it became mastered by it. It was beyond the strength of any will, even Sauron's own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. It is literally impossible to willingly destroy the ring. Absolutely no one, not even the Maiar who created it, could destroy it. Even Frodo, who's like the least corruptible guy in the entire world, ultimately fails to destroy it. The idea that Isildur, one of the greatest kings of men ever to live, is some kind of a bad dude just because he didn't destroy the ring 3,000 years before anyone else thought to destroy it is absolutely absurd. Isildur is, was, and always shall be a hero. Anyway, there's my top 10 list of Second Age characters. Let me know if I missed any of your favourites, and look out for a pinned comment with some honourable mentions. Of course, to make sure you don't miss any future top 10 lists or any of my Silmarillion explained videos, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and share this channel with your friends if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.